They didn't say a word when I packed my bags. Not my mother, not my sister, not even my father, who used to read to me every night when I was little. The silence was louder than any scream, filling every corner of the house I'd called home for 26 years. I'd spent the last few weeks watching them exchange glances at the dinner table, whisper behind closed doors, and act like my presence was a burden they could barely tolerate. Somewhere along the way, I had become invisible in my own home. Final push came on a rainy Thursday in October. I'd been turned down for another job, the third rejection in 2 weeks, and when I came home, soaked to the bone and shaking from more than just the cold, I found the guest room cleared out. My room, the space that had been mine since I'd moved back after my divorce. My childhood photos were stacked in a cardboard box near the trash, water-stained and forgotten. The quilt my grandmother had made for me was folded carelessly on top, like it meant nothing. No one offered to help me bring the box inside. No one even looked up when I walked through the door, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floors my mother had always been so protective of. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching, especially if you've ever felt invisible in the place you should have felt most seen. I tried to speak, to ask why they'd packed up my life without a word. But something in me froze when I saw the way my sister stared at her phone, the way my mother wiped the kitchen counter in small, aggressive circles like I wasn't even there. The way my father sat in his recliner, reading the same page of his newspaper over and over again. I realized in that moment that I wasn't part of this family anymore. Maybe I never had been. I left carrying a single suitcase, the weight of everything I couldn't take with me heavy on my shoulders. No goodbye. No explanation. Just the cold echo of their indifference trailing behind me like a ghost. The front door clicked shut with the same sound it had made every day of my childhood, but this time, it felt final. The world outside felt cruel, but honest. At least out there, silence didn't pretend to be love. I crashed on my college friend, Sarah's couch for 3 weeks, promising I'd find my own place soon while I pieced together shifts at a diner downtown. The Bluebird Cafe wasn't much, cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since morning, but it was mine in a way my childhood home never was. Nobody there expected me to disappear. Nobody there treated kindness like a limited resource. Between the breakfast rush and dinner crowd, I'd pull out my old composition notebook and scribble thoughts that felt too heavy to carry alone. It started as a kind of therapy, writing what I couldn't say out loud. The stories poured out like water from a broken dam. Memories of a mother who flinched at hugs, treating affection like something that might stain her clothes. A father who stopped asking how school was when I turned 16, as if my thoughts had simply stopped mattering. A sister who only spoke to me when she needed something reflected back. Validation, approval, an audience for her achievements. I wrote about the Christmas morning when I was 12, how excited I'd been to give them the picture frame I'd decorated with shells from our summer vacation. How my mother had smiled that tight smile and set it aside, never to be seen again. I wrote about my graduation from college, how I'd searched the crowd for their faces and found them checking their phones instead of watching me walk across the stage. I wrote about my wedding day, how my sister had spent the reception complaining about the centerpieces I'd spent months choosing, and how my parents had left early without saying goodbye. Every sentence was a reclamation, every paragraph a stitch, in a soul that had been torn so slowly I hadn't noticed the bleeding until it was too late. The work was hard, but the writing was harder. Facing the truth of how unloved I'd felt required a courage I didn't know I possessed. Some nights, I'd write until my hand cramped and my eyes burned, trying to capture the specific ache of being treated like a stranger by the people who were supposed to know you best. Other nights, I'd stare at blank pages, overwhelmed by the weight of everything I'd never been allowed to say. But slowly, something shifted. The words that had been trapped inside me for years began to find their shape. I started recognizing patterns, connecting dots between moments that had seemed isolated. At the time, the way my achievements were minimized while my failures were cataloged, the way my needs were treated as inconveniences while everyone else's were priorities, the way love in my family had always felt conditional, something to be earned rather than given freely. I worked double shifts to save money for a studio apartment across town. It was small, just 400 square feet with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette, but it was mine. Nobody could pack up my life while I was out looking for work. Nobody could make me feel like a guest in my own space. I enrolled in online journalism, courses, watching tutorials between shifts and writing practice articles late into the night. Most of my early attempts were terrible, too emotional, too raw, too personal for publication. But I kept writing anyway, learning to channel that pain into something that might help someone else feel less alone. The breakthrough came 6 months later, when I pitched a personal essay to a magazine I'd been following for years. The editor, a woman named Claire Matthews, emailed back within hours. Her response was just one line. "I see you." 3 words that meant more than all the silence from my family combined. Claire had walked out of her own family home at 19, she told me later. She recognized the particular kind of grief that comes from mourning people who are still alive, who chose to love you less rather than love you differently. She helped me shape my story, to write the truth without drowning in bitterness. It took 2 years of revisions, of learning to trust my own voice, of believing that my pain mattered enough to put into words. The article wasn't just about my family's silence. It was about the invisible ways people can make you disappear, how emotional neglect leaves scars you can't see but carry everywhere. It was about the children who grow up apologizing for existing, who learn to make themselves smaller and smaller until they wonder if they're even real. It was about the particular cruelty of withholding love from someone who has never learned to love themselves. When Claire accepted the final draft, I cried in the Bluebird Cafe's bathroom for 20 minutes. Not from sadness, but from relief. Someone had finally heard me. Someone had finally said, yes, your story matters. Yes, your pain is real. Yes, you deserve to take up space in this world. The article was scheduled to run in the magazine's next issue, but Claire warned me it might take months to gain traction. Personal essays were unpredictable, she said. Some resonated immediately. Others found their audience slowly. I braced myself for silence, for another kind of rejection. I should have known better than to brace for silence. This story was too loud to be ignored. The article exploded overnight. It started with a few hundred shares on social media, people tagging friends with messages like, "This made me think of you," and "You're not alone." Then a popular psychology account reshared it with a caption about emotional abuse, and the numbers climbed into the thousands. By the end of the week, it had been shared by teachers who recognized their students in my words, therapists who printed copies for their waiting rooms, celebrities who added their own stories of family rejection in the comments. The article was translated into 6 languages. Recovery centers reached out asking permission to use excerpts in their materials. I started receiving emails from strangers around the world, sharing their own stories of invisible wounds and silent abandonment. A woman in Tokyo wrote to tell me she'd finally gotten the courage to move out of her mother's house. A man in Chicago said he'd started therapy after reading my words. A teenager in small-town Ohio said she'd realized she wasn't crazy, that her family's coldness wasn't her fault. I watched the view count climb into the millions, each number representing someone who had felt unseen and had chosen to see themselves in my story instead. The comments section became a sanctuary for people who had never found words for their pain, who had been gaslit into believing their hurt wasn't real. And then I saw them. My sister's name appeared in the share notifications first. Then my mother's. Then my father's. No comments. No messages. Just the silent acknowledgement that they had read it, that they had finally encountered the version of events they'd spent years pretending didn't exist. I stared at my phone screen for a long time, watching their names appear and disappear as the notifications rolled in. Part of me had always wondered if they truly didn't know how much they'd hurt me, if maybe they'd been too lost in their own pain to see mine. But seeing their names there, seeing that they'd read every word and chosen silence again, confirmed what I'd always suspected deep down. They knew exactly what they'd done. They just hadn't cared enough to change. The silence that followed was different this time. It didn't cut like it used to. Instead, it felt like confirmation, like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve my entire life. I had spent years wondering what I'd done wrong, what flaw in my character had made me so easy to dismiss. Now I understood that their silence wasn't about me at all. It was about them, about their inability to face the mirror I'd held up to, their choices. 3 weeks after the article went viral, my phone rang at 2 a.m. I recognized my mother's number, though I hadn't heard from her in over a year. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message with my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to talk," her voice said, clipped and cold as always. What you've done, it's not fair. People are calling us, asking questions. Your cousin Linda saw it, and now she's asking your father if we really threw you out. You've made us look like monsters." I played the message 3 times, searching for an apology that wasn't there, for any acknowledgement that maybe they should look like monsters because that's how they'd behaved. Instead, I heard the same deflection I'd grown up with, the same refusal to take responsibility for their actions. They weren't upset that they'd hurt me. They were upset that other people now knew they'd hurt me. I didn't call back. Instead, I saved the voicemail and went back to my laptop, where I was working on a follow-up piece about the response to my article. Claire had asked me to write about what it felt like to have my story resonate with so many people, to explore the phenomenon of viral emotional truth-telling in the digital age. But the deeper story was what happened when the people who hurt you were forced to see themselves through someone else's eyes, when privacy could no longer protect them from the consequences of their choices. When silence stopped being a weapon they could use against you and became a spotlight illuminating exactly who they were. The messages kept coming. My mother called, again the next week, this time during normal hours. Then my sister texted, a single line. "Can we please talk about this?" My father, predictably, said nothing directly, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been telling people the article was exaggerated, that I'd always been dramatic, that families were complicated and outsiders couldn't understand the boss. Same people who had made me feel crazy for wanting basic kindness were now trying to convince others that my memories were unreliable. My pain was manufactured. My truth was somehow suspect. It was gaslighting on a public scale, and it might have worked if I were still the same person who had left their house with a single suitcase. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had spent 2 years learning to trust my own perceptions, to value my own experience, to believe that my feelings were valid, even when no one else would validate them. I had built a life where my voice mattered, where my story had power, where I didn't need anyone's permission to exist fully. The requests for interviews started coming in. Podcasts wanted to discuss the article's impact. Television producers called about featuring my story in segments about family estrangement. A literary agent reached out about turning my experience into a book. I said yes to some and no to others, learning to discern between opportunities that honored my story and those that sensationalized it. I appeared on a morning show where the host, a woman who had been estranged from her own mother for 15 years, interviewed me with the kind of understanding that can only come from shared experience. I did a podcast with a therapist who specialized in family trauma, where we talked about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, between healing and reunion. Each interview felt like another layer of armor, another way of claiming my narrative before anyone else could distort it. I learned to speak about my experience without defensiveness, to own my truth without needing others to validate it. Most importantly, I learned that my family's version of events didn't matter anymore. The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. 6 months after the article's publication, I received an email that made me laugh out loud in the middle of the Bluebird Cafe. It was from my hometown newspaper, asking if I'd be interested in writing a weekly column about overcoming adversity. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same community that had watched my family treat me like a pariah was now offering me a platform to share my voice. I accepted the offer, partly because I needed the income, but mostly because I loved the symmetry. Every week, my byline would appear in the paper my parents read over their morning coffee. Every week, they'd be reminded that I hadn't disappeared the way they'd hoped. I had become more present in their lives through my absence than I'd ever been through my presence. My first column ran on a Tuesday in April, exactly 2 years after I'd left their house. The subject was about the difference between being alone and being lonely, about how solitude can be a gift you give yourself rather than a punishment imposed by others. I wrote about finding peace in my small apartment, about the luxury of not having to monitor someone else's mood before deciding whether to speak. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Readers shared their own stories of liberation, of discovering that the people who claimed to love them had actually been holding them back. The newspaper's editor told me it was the most engagement they'd seen on a column in years. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. When I opened it, I found a photo of my parents' kitchen table, my column spread out next to my father's reading glasses. The message below read, "Thought you should know they read every word. Your neighbor, Mrs. Henderson." I stared at the photo for a long time, imagining them sitting at that table, reading my words over their morning coffee. Did they finally understand what they'd lost? Did they recognize themselves in the family I'd described? The one that measured love in conditions and withheld affection like a reward to be earned? More importantly, did it matter? The answer, I realized, was no. Their recognition, or lack thereof, couldn't change what had happened between us. It couldn't erase the years of feeling invisible, the birthdays forgotten, the achievements minimized, the pain dismissed. Their reading my words didn't constitute an apology, and their silence afterward didn't constitute acceptance. What mattered was that I had found my voice, and people were listening. What mattered was that strangers felt less alone because I had been brave enough to tell the truth. What mattered was that I had built a life where I didn't need anyone's permission to exist. My second book came out the following spring, a collection of essays about belonging and exile, about finding family in unexpected places and learning to mother yourself when no one else will. The launch event was held at a bookstore downtown, the same neighborhood where I'd once served coffee to make rent. 60 people showed up, more than I'd dared to hope for. They asked thoughtful questions about the writing process, about healing, from family trauma, about the responsibility that comes with sharing personal stories publicly. An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand and asked if I'd ever regretted writing the article that made me famous. I thought about it for a moment, really considered the question. Had I regretted it? The sleepless nights when the interviews felt overwhelming? The moments when I'd wondered if I'd exposed too much, shared too deeply? The complicated feelings that came with profit from pain? No, I said finally. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I had to choose between silence and healing, between loyalty and truth. But I don't regret finding my voice. I don't regret helping other people find theirs. After the event, as I signed books and thanked people for coming, I noticed a familiar figure lingering near the back of the store. My sister stood there, partially hidden behind a display of bestsellers, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She looked older, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Our eyes met across the crowded bookstore, and for a moment, I saw the girl she used to be, the one who would sneak into my room during thunderstorms and fall, asleep holding my hand. Before she became someone who measured her worth by diminishing mine, before she learned that love was a zero-sum game where my happiness somehow threatened hers. She looked like she might approach, like she might finally say the words that had been hanging between us for years. But then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening crowd like she'd never been there at all. I finished signing books and packing up my things, thinking about that glimpse of recognition in her eyes. Maybe she'd read my book. Maybe she'd seen herself in the sister I'd written about, the one who had chosen silence over solidarity, competition over compassion. Maybe she'd finally understood what we'd both lost. Or maybe she was just curious about the life I'd built without them, the success I'd achieved despite their predictions that I'd never amount to anything without their support. Either way, her presence felt like an ending, a final acknowledgement of what we'd once been and what we'd chosen to become instead. The quiet that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, full of the voices of people who had found courage in my story, full of the family I'd created from friends and mentors, and readers who understood that love doesn't have to be earned, that belonging doesn't require permission, that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is refusing to be loyal to people who don't deserve it. I drove home to my apartment, no longer small but expanded twice over the years, where the walls were covered with letters from readers, photos, with fellow writers, articles I'd published, awards I'd won. Evidence of a life lived fully, loudly, on my own terms. On my nightstand sat a copy of that first viral article, framed not as a trophy but as a reminder. A reminder that stories are too powerful to be silenced, that truth has a way of finding its audience, that sometimes the people who try hardest to make you disappear are the ones who end up invisible instead. They had watched me leave without a word, thinking my silence would protect their secrets, that my absence would erase their choices. They had expected me to disappear quietly, to carry their shame as my own, to protect their reputation at the cost of my truth. Instead, they watched me find my voice in the place they'd tried to silence me. They watched strangers celebrate the story they'd tried to bury. They watched me build a family from the pieces of the one they'd broken. I didn't get revenge. I got something better. I got recognition, not just from the world, but from myself. I learned that my story mattered, that my pain was real, that my voice deserved to be heard. And in the end, the family that taught me I didn't matter had to learn that I mattered to everyone else.